Shadows at Petra. The year is 1938. A warm, golden haze settles over the Holy Land as a luxury tour group arrives, their spirits high, with the promise of discovery and adventure. Ancient ruins, silent witnesses to millennia of history, glimmer under the scorching desert sun. Amidst the chatter and anticipation of the group, one figure stands apart not by choice, but by the oppressive air that surrounds her. Mrs. Boynton, a name that evokes an involuntary shiver among her family members, is no ordinary traveler. Her imposing figure, sharp eyes, and clipped, authoritative tone leave no doubt about her dominion. Every word she speaks is laced with control, every glance calculated to keep her family in line. Those unfortunate enough to share her blood are bound by invisible chains, tethered to a matriarch whose pleasure lies in their misery. Her presence looms like a storm cloud, darkening even the brightest of days. The Boynton family's discomfort is palpable to the other tourists, who exchange uneasy glances but dare not voice their thoughts. Raymond Boynton, Mrs. Boynton's son, carries an air of fragility, his hunched posture and darting eyes speaking of a life lived in fear. Nadine Boynton, the daughter-in-law, offers polite smiles that don't quite reach her eyes, the weight of unspoken sorrow etched into her delicate features. And then here is Ginevra Boynton, the youngest, her distant gaze hinting at a mind retreating into a world of her own, where imaginary friends promise solace her reality cannot. Among the group is Dr. Sarah King, a young doctor whose sharp intellect and compassionate nature contrast sharply with the oppressive dynamics of the Boynton family. Her curiosity is piqued by their strange behavior, her observations revealing more questions than answers. And then here is Hercule Poirot, a man whose name needs no introduction. Though traveling for leisure, his sharp, observant eyes miss nothing. He, too, senses the tension radiating from the Boyntons, a tension that seems to thrum louder with every passing hour. It is against this backdrop that the unthinkable happens. During an excursion to an isolated archaeological site, the oppressive shadow of Mrs. Boynton is lifted, but not in a way anyone expected. Her lifeless body is discovered slumped against a weathered rock, the ancient ruins around her now, a silent stage for a fresh tragedy. The local police, accustomed to the harsh realities of desert travel, quickly conclude that her death was natural, perhaps the result of overexertion in the relentless heat. But Poirot's instincts tell him otherwise. Whispers of suppressed anger, fearful glances exchanged among the Boyntons, and the subtle clues left in their wake paint a picture far more sinister. Poirot's curiosity is piqued, and with it, the wheels of his unmatched mind begin to turn. What was it about Mrs. Boynton that held her family in such a vice-like grip, and what secrets could have led to her untimely death? The desert's secrets will soon be unearthed, but not all who dig into the shadows will emerge unscathed. A tyrant's grip. Poirot immerses himself in the Boynton family's tragic narrative, uncovering Mrs. Boynton's reign of psychological terror. Every aspect of their lives was meticulously controlled. Meals, interactions, even their thoughts seemed bound by her rules. Her presence loomed large over the household, a shadow too daunting to escape. Witnesses recount how she would dangle hope like a cruel jest offering the prospect of release, only to snatch it away. Poirot pieces together stories of unfulfilled dreams, crushed ambitions, and stolen joys. She orchestrated conflicts among the family, ensuring their reliance on her. The question grows clearer in his mind. Who had finally found the courage to resist her tyranny? Raymond's fleeting escape plans. Poirot's conversations with Raymond reveal a young man on the edge of breaking free. His plans for escape were fragile, yet earnest small sums of money saved from allowances, carefully plotted routes to a new life. But his fear of reprisal kept him rooted. Poirot observes the conflicting emotions in Raymond's eyes. The yearning for freedom, tinged with guilt over abandoning his siblings. One slip of the tongue hints at a heated argument with Mrs. Boynton, before her death? Was his resolve to escape strong enough to push him toward murder, or was someone else aware of his plans? Nadine's Diary of Frustrations. Nadine's diary becomes a treasure trove of insight for Poirot. Her words lay bare the emotional scars inflicted by years under Mrs. Boynton's thumb. She writes about her growing resentment, her longing for a life outside the suffocating walls of the family. Poirot finds a particularly poignant entry. "If only she would vanish, we could all breathe again." The diary reveals her struggles to maintain loyalty to her husband, Jefferson, while yearning for independence. Poirot is struck by the rawness of her entries. Did her desperation lead to action? Or was she another victim in this tangled web? Ginevra's Imaginary Conversations. Poirot's keen eye focuses on Ginevra, whose fragile mental state becomes a key thread in the investigation. Her whispered dialogues with imaginary figures hint at deep psychological trauma. She talks of justice and vengeance, weaving fantastical narratives where she is both victim and savior. Poirot cannot dismiss her as merely delusional. Her words carry veiled truths. Could her subconscious have driven her to an act of violence, or is she merely echoing the collective anger of the family? A mysterious letter. Poirot's discovery of the torn letter adds a tantalizing layer to the mystery. The fragment reads, "Tonight it ends." The handwriting is jagged, as if written in haste or anger. Poirot theorizes that the letter was intended for Mrs. Boynton but never delivered. Who wrote it, and what did they hope to accomplish that night? The unanswered questions gnaw at him, pushing him closer to the truth. Unlikely allies. Dr. Sarah King emerges as an essential ally in Poirot's investigation. Her observations of the family dynamics, the furtive glances, the tension-filled silence offer Poirot valuable leads. Her medical background allows her to detect signs of stress and fear among the Boyntons, details that Poirot uses to build his case. Yet, Sarah's involvement isn't without scrutiny. Poirot wonders, is she merely an observer, or does she have her own reasons for wanting justice? A web of lies. The deeper Poirot delves, the more convoluted the story becomes. Each family member's account of the fateful night contradicts the others, forming a labyrinth of deceit. Poirot's methodical mind begins untangling these lies, noting the inconsistencies and identifying the truths hidden within. Every revelation tightens the noose around the culprit, but it also lays bare the years of pain and oppression that have scarred the family. The secrets unearthed paint a grim picture of a household broken by tyranny and driven to desperation. With each clue, Poirot inches closer to unveiling the truth. Yet, he is acutely aware of the stakes. The sands of the desert hold their secrets tightly, but Poirot's determination is unwavering. The path to justice, he knows, is never straightforward. A lethal injection. The revelation of poison in Mrs. Boynton's system shatters the initial assumption of a natural death. The local authorities, hesitant to confront the possibility of murder, reluctantly reopen the case. Poirot, however, seizes the moment with characteristic precision. The poison, a rare and exotic substance derived from desert plants, speaks of careful planning. It was not something easily obtained or administered without knowledge. Poirot's meticulous questioning of the family and staff reveals an unsettling detail. Someone had access to Mrs. Boynton's medical supplies. A trained eye would be required to inject the poison subtly, without raising suspicion. Poirot's focus sharpens on the moments leading up to Mrs. Boynton's death. Who had approached her that day? Who had the opportunity and, more importantly, the knowledge to carry out such an act? The murder, he reasons, is not one of passion, but of calculated intent. It is a chilling prospect. Someone had resolved to end Mrs. Boynton's reign with methodical precision, ensuring no loose ends would point back to them. An unexpected witness. Poirot's investigation takes an unexpected turn when a Bedouin guide, previously thought to be an inconsequential observer, steps forward. The guide describes seeing a shadowy figure near Mrs. Boynton's tent the night of her death. The figure, cloaked in darkness, moved with deliberate care, avoiding the faint glow of the lanterns. Poirot listens intently, his mind racing with possibilities. The description is vague and no distinct features, no incriminating details, but the timing aligns too perfectly to be dismissed. Poirot questions the guide further, probing for any small detail that might break the case wide open. The guide hesitates, then reveals something astonishing. The figure paused briefly, seemingly to listen for movement within the camp, before disappearing into the night. Poirot's sharp mind connects this behavior with the calculated nature of the crime. The killer had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Red herrings. As Poirot digs deeper, he uncovers a stranger's journal among the camp's belongings. The journal, bound in worn leather, contains cryptic entries about Mrs. Boynton's past. The writer's tone shifts between admiration and hatred, painting a complex portrait of someone obsessed with her. Poirot's curiosity is piqued. Who was this stranger, and what was their connection to Mrs. Boynton? The entries suggest a vendetta rooted in events long before the Boynton family's journey to the Holy Land. One passage in particular stands out. "She will pay for what she did. The world must see her true face." Poirot considers the possibility of an external threat, a shadow from Mrs. Boynton's past returning to haunt her. But as he examines the journal more closely, he detects inconsistencies. The handwriting does not match any samples taken from the Boynton family or staff. Was this a deliberate plant to mislead the investigation? Poirot's instincts tell him to tread carefully. The journal may be a red herring, designed to divert attention from the true culprit. A tapestry of motives, the discovery of poison, a mysterious figure, and the journal forces Poirot to reevaluate his theories. He begins to see the crime as a tapestry, woven with multiple threads, each suspect's motives intertwined with another's. Mrs. Boynton's death, he realizes, is not just the culmination of years of familial strife, but also a flashpoint for long-buried secrets. Poirot's sharp intellect discerns patterns others might overlook. The Boynton family's collective anguish, the Bedouin guide's observation, and the journal's cryptic threats, all these elements are pieces of a larger puzzle. The investigation takes Poirot deep into the family psyche. He revisits their accounts of the night, comparing their words against the growing body of evidence. The contradictions become glaring. Raymond's nervous demeanor, Nadine's veiled anger, Ginevra's cryptic remarks, and even Sarah King's measured observations, each carries a kernel of truth wrapped in layers of deceit. Poirot knows the key lies not just in what they say, but in what they avoid saying. The shadow of conspiracy. Poirot begins to suspect a larger conspiracy at play. Mrs. Boynton's control extended beyond her immediate family. Her connections and influence touched lives far removed from the camp. Poirot's inquiries uncover whispers of financial dealings, debts unpaid, and alliances forged in secrecy. Was the poison meant only for Mrs. Boynton? Or was it a message to others who defied the same shadowy forces? Poirot's relentless pursuit of the truth brings him face to face with the fragility of human nature. The poison that ended Mrs. Boynton's life symbolizes not just death, but also the toxic influence she wielded. As the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, Poirot prepares to unveil the truth, knowing that the shadows of the past may yet cast their final, damning light on the present. With the stage set and the suspect's motives laid bare, Poirot inches closer to a revelation that will shake the Boynton family to its core. The poison's legacy, he realizes, is not just the death of a tyrant, but the unmasking of secrets that may forever change the lives of those she left behind. Climax. Shadows in the ruins. The wind whispered through the narrow canyons of Petra, carrying with it a haunting chill that settled deep within the bones of the gathered group. The ancient sandstone structures, bathed in the fading light of the desert sun, loomed like silent sentinels. They had walked through this historic labyrinth before, but tonight, the ruins felt charged with a darker energy. The group had been led to the grand, weathered temple, its columns reaching toward the sky, cracked and worn from centuries of erosion. Here, Poirot had chosen to confront them alone last time. The tension was palpable, as each member of the tour group stood, somewhat uneasily, in the shadow of the grand facade. Mrs. Boynton's death had shaken them, but there was an unnerving realization creeping upon them, that all of them might be somehow involved. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the faces before him, each mask of uncertainty and feigned innocence telling its own story. "Tonight we shall speak the truth," Poirot said softly, his voice a low command, as if the words themselves were imbued with the weight of centuries. The detective's gaze turned first to Dr. Sarah King. Her calm demeanor was at odds with the clenched fists hidden beneath her pristine jacket sleeves. "Dr. King," Poirot began, "you were closest to the victim in the hours leading to her death. Tell me, was it your concern for her health that brought you to her side, or something else? Perhaps a hidden alliance?" The air seemed to thicken with the question. Dr. King's face remained composed, but the faintest flicker of something, guilt, regret, or even fear, passed through her eyes. She shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her secrets pressing against her chest. Poirot wasn't finished. He could see it, the cracks in her facade, and he pressed on. "Tell me of your relationship with Mrs. Boynton," Poirot continued. "The history that binds you?" Sarah's lips parted slightly, her breath shallow, and for a moment it seemed as if she might collapse under the pressure, but then her eyes hardened. "I was her personal physician, Monsieur Poirot, nothing more." But Poirot, the master of observation, wasn't buying it. "Ah, but the truth. It is rarely so simple, n'est-ce pas?" His words rang out in the vast temple, echoing off the stone walls. "You see, there are whispers of a more personal connection. A debt, perhaps, or a more emotional involvement." A deep silence followed. The others shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. Mrs. Boynton's oppressive shadow seemed to hang over them all, and Poirot's relentless pursuit of the truth was digging at something they all hoped would remain buried. Poirot turned his attention now to the youngest of the group, Michael, the quiet, brooding man who seemed to avoid eye contact. His disheveled appearance, a telltale sign of inner turmoil, caught Poirot's attention. "You?" Poirot said, his voice a little softer, though no less commanding. "Have you been hiding something, Michael? Something beyond the obvious grief you claim to feel for the death of your stepmother?" Michael flinched, his eyes darting nervously. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. Poirot stepped closer, his shoes tapping softly against the ancient stones. "Oh, but you do. Your debts, your secrets. It is not just your stepmother's passing that has shaken you. It is what she held over you. The ties that bound you together in a financial prison, one that only her death could release you from." Michael's face turned pale, and the facade crumbled. His eyes locked onto Poirot's, filled with a raw desperation. I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I wanted her to change her will, but not like this." The truth spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and the others in the group gasped as the weight of his confession filled the air. Michael had been trying to force his stepmother's hand, to change the inheritance in his favor. His quiet rage had been building for years, hidden beneath layers of politeness. But it was not him who had struck the fatal blow. He had only planned it, and his co-conspirator had been closer than anyone realized. Poirot turned to the final key figure in the room, the elusive Mrs. Boynton's son, who had appeared detached from the emotional chaos surrounding the death. His eyes flickered nervously as Poirot turned his steady gaze toward him. "And you," Poirot said, his voice like the strike of a clock's chime. "You were not as innocent as you pretended to be, were you? You knew of the plan. You helped orchestrate it." The son's jaw tightened, and he took a step back, as if trying to distance himself from the scrutiny. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, barely audible, his words revealing his complicity. "She was unbearable. We all wanted her gone, but no one could bring themselves to do it." Poirot's expression remained unchanged, his mind piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. Mrs. Boynton had been a tyrant, manipulating her family for years. Her death was the result of years of anger, deceit, and desperation, but in the end, it was not a single hand that ended her life. It was the combined forces of a family long broken by resentment, buried secrets, and betrayal. With the last piece of the puzzle in place, Poirot stood silently for a moment, his piercing gaze sweeping over the group. The wind outside howled through the ruins, as if urging him to finish what he had started. "You?" Poirot said, his voice a little softer, though no less commanding. "Have you been hiding something, Michael? Something beyond the obvious grief you claim to feel for the death of your stepmother?" Michael flinched, his eyes darting nervously. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. Poirot stepped closer, his shoes tapping softly against the ancient stones. "Oh, but you do. Your debts, your secrets. It is not just your stepmother's passing that has shaken you. It is what she held over you. The ties that bound you together in a financial prison, one that only her death could release you from." Michael's face turned pale, and the facade crumbled. His eyes locked onto Poirot's, filled with a raw desperation. I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I wanted her to change her will, but not like this." The truth spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and the others in the group gasped as the weight of his confession filled the air. Michael had been trying to force his stepmother's hand, to change the inheritance in his favor. His quiet rage had been building for years, hidden beneath layers of politeness. But it was not him who had struck the fatal blow. He had only planned it, and his co-conspirator had been closer than anyone realized. Poirot turned to the final key figure in the room, the elusive Mrs. Boynton's son, who had appeared detached from the emotional chaos surrounding the death. His eyes flickered nervously as Poirot turned his steady gaze toward him. "And you," Poirot said, his voice like the strike of a clock's chime. "You were not as innocent as you pretended to be, were you? You knew of the plan. You helped orchestrate it." The son's jaw tightened, and he took a step back, as if trying to distance himself from the scrutiny. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, barely audible, his words revealing his complicity. "She was unbearable. We all wanted her gone, but no one could bring themselves to do it." Poirot's expression remained unchanged, his mind piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. Mrs. Boynton had been a tyrant, manipulating her family for years. Her death was the result of years of anger, deceit, and desperation, but in the end, it was not a single hand that ended her life. It was the combined forces of a family long broken by resentment, buried secrets, and betrayal. With the last piece of the puzzle in place, Poirot stood silently for a moment, his piercing gaze sweeping over the group. The wind outside howled through the ruins, as if urging him to finish what he had started. A murmur rippled through the group. Mrs. Boynton's son, his face pale, took an instinctive step back, his hand brushing against the worn stone wall behind him. Dr. King's eyes darted around the room, looking for any escape, her fingers twitching in her coat pockets. Michael, his earlier confession still fresh in the air, swallowed hard, but his eyes were wild, frantic. Poirot held up a hand, signaling for silence. The world around them seemed to stop, the echoes of time falling away, as the detective stood at the center of it all, a man who knew, at last, who had committed the crime. "You see, the murder of Mrs. Boynton," Poirot said, "was not simply a matter of inheritance. No, it was something far deeper. A desire not just for freedom, but for vengeance, for liberation from the years of control, of manipulation. The victim's death was not the result of a single moment of rage. It was the culmination of years of slow-burning hatred." The words hung in the air like smoke, curling around the group's collective consciousness. Poirot's eyes, sharp as daggers, landed on the unassuming woman standing just behind the others, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. It was Mrs. Boynton's daughter, the soft-spoken, seemingly innocent woman who had hardly spoken a word since the beginning of their journey. "You," Poirot said, his voice now filled with a chilling certainty. "You are the one who killed your mother." A stunned silence fell over the group. It was as if time itself had stopped. The woman, Catherine, stood frozen, her face ashen. Her lips parted, but no words came. A tremor ran through her, but she did not break down, did not fall to her knees as they had expected. Instead, her eyes, those pale, tired eyes, met Poirot's with an eerie calm. "You," she whispered, almost as if the words were foreign to her. "You knew." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he observed her reaction. "Ah, madame, I knew from the start it was always you. Your motive was the most pure, the most complex, love and hate, both entwined. You were the one who could not forgive your mother for what she did to you, for what she did to your family." Catherine took a deep breath, her face tightening. She ruined us," she murmured, as if speaking to herself, her voice a mixture of pain and resolve. "She took everything. Our futures, our identities, our happiness, all in the name of control, all for her twisted version of what family should be. She destroyed us." Poirot took a step toward her, his voice steady but cutting. "You were the one who saw through her lies. You knew that she had to be stopped. And when her death came, it was not only a release, it was revenge for all the years of suffering. The inheritance? A secondary matter. What you truly wanted was her control over you gone forever." Catherine's lips curled into a grim smile, though her eyes were filled with a mix of sorrow and something darker, satisfaction. "You're right, it was never just about the money. It was about freedom, freedom from the woman who had held us all captive. I planned it. I waited. I made sure she was alone that night when the poison could do its work without interference." Her hands, trembling slightly now, moved to her side. Slowly, she pulled a small vial from her coat pocket, dark, glass, and deadly. "You poisoned her," Poirot continued, his voice quiet but fierce. "You knew exactly what you were doing, and you made sure it looked like a natural death, a heart attack. It was clever, very clever. No one would have suspected you, the quiet daughter, the meek one, the one who suffered silently. But the truth is, this was the only way to set yourself free." Catherine's expression shifted, a brief flicker of regret passing through her. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. She straightened, her resolve hardening once more. "She made me do it. I didn't have a choice. She would have never let me live my life. She was poison, and I had to stop her." Poirot nodded solemnly, but his eyes never left her. "You have been freed, madame, but not without cost. The blood you sought to spill has stained your hands." The group, still in shock, looked at Catherine with a mixture of disbelief and pity. Some whispered under their breath. Others stood frozen, too stunned to react. Catherine glanced at each of them, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I've lived with this my whole life," she said, her voice hollow. "And now I will face the consequences." As she was led away by the authorities, Poirot remained standing, watching the figures move through the ancient ruins. The desert winds whispered in the distance, carrying the secrets of a family shattered by betrayal and vengeance. The killer had been unmasked, not the one they expected, but the one who had carried the darkest secrets of all. And in the shadows of Petra, the truth had finally come to light. The morning after the storm of revelations, the ruins of Petra stood silent beneath a sky washed clean by the night's winds. The ancient stones, witnesses to centuries of human history, now seemed to absorb the weight of an entirely different kind of truth. The truth of a family freed from the suffocating grasp of a tyrant. The group, disbanded and scattered, began the long, painful process of rebuilding their lives. Mrs. Boynton's death had been the catalyst, the final violent upheaval that shattered the brittle facade of their existence. But now, in the aftermath, something new began to stir in the remains of the wreckage. Catherine, the woman who had orchestrated her mother's demise, stood alone at the edge of the camp, looking out over the desert landscape. Her eyes, once clouded with bitterness, now seemed to hold the faintest glimmer of something else. Perhaps hope, perhaps redemption. The hard lines of her face had softened, and there was a tentative calm about her as she took in the view. Behind her, her brother Michael approached, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion. His once haggard face had lost some of its weariness, but the scars of years spent in the shadow of their mother's cruelty still lingered in his eyes. They exchanged a look, heavy with unspoken words. "Do you think we'll ever be free of her?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine didn't turn to him right away. She stood still, her fingers running lightly over the rim of the stone she leaned against. "No," she said finally, her voice softer than he expected. "But we have a chance now, a chance to rebuild, to be who we were always meant to be." Michael nodded, though his gaze remained distant, as if uncertain of the path ahead. "It's hard to know where to begin." Catherine smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Michael had seen in years. "Maybe we start with forgiveness for ourselves." She paused, considering her own words. "We can't change the past, Michael, but we can decide what we do with the future." In the distance, Dr. Sarah King walked alone, her shoulders straight, her expression guarded, but not as tightly wound as before. She had spoken little since the night of the confession, but now, as she glanced over her shoulder at the ruins, a sense of resolution seemed to settle in her. She had known for years the toll that Mrs. Boynton's manipulation had taken on this family, and while she had never condoned the act of murder, there was something undeniably freeing in the air. The power of control that had once crushed their spirits was gone, and in its place, a strange kind of liberation lingered. The others, too, began to stir. The oppressive atmosphere that had gripped them for so long seemed to evaporate as each person took tentative steps into their own new lives. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping moments of catharsis, but in every gesture, every quiet movement, they could feel the weight of a heavy chain lifting from their shoulders. The boy's heirloom ring, once a symbol of captivity, was now tossed aside, forgotten in the dust of the past. Poirot, watching from the edge of the camp, stood in quiet reflection. His job was done. The murder had been solved, the guilty punished, and justice, however imperfect, had been served. But even in the triumph of revealing the killer, there was a lingering sadness in his heart. He had witnessed too many lives touched by suffering, too many people torn apart by greed, vengeance, and fear. The group, once so fractured, was now united in their shared grief and the weight of their newfound freedom. Yet Poirot knew well that this was not the end of their journey, but rather the beginning of something much harder, the rebuilding of a family that had been shattered not just by a murder, but by years of emotional imprisonment. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting its warm glow over the desert landscape, Poirot turned away. His heart ached, but it was not for the family alone. It was for the complexities of human nature, the emotions that lay hidden beneath the surface, the decisions made in the heat of passion, and the ultimate price that had to be paid for freedom. Poirot's reflection. Poirot made his way to the small, solitary cabin that had been set up for him, his mind full of the same thoughts that had consumed him since the moment he first set foot in this place. He could not forget the faces of those he had uncovered, the brokenness that had shaped them all, nor the fine thread of cruelty and love that had bound them together. The detective paused at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. There was a certain serenity in the air now, a peace that had been absent for so long, and yet something gnawed at him, a disquiet that refused to be silenced. He knew that the darkness of human emotion was not so easily defeated. It lingered, always, beneath the surface, ready to return in another form, in another moment of weakness. Poirot entered the cabin, sitting by the small desk in the corner. He poured himself a drink, a small comfort after the storm he had weathered, and took a moment to reflect. He thought of Catherine, standing on the edge of freedom, her hands stained with her own brand of vengeance, but also with the promise of a new beginning. He thought of Michael, who had been forced to live in the shadows of his own guilt and confusion, now left to find his own way in a world that had changed irrevocably. He thought of Sarah, whose quiet strength had never wavered, and who, like the others, now had to live with the ghosts of the past and the complexities of her own choices. Poirot's gaze drifted to the window, where the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the distant cries of the desert birds. It was a sound both haunting and beautiful, as though the land itself had witnessed too much, yet continued to endure. In the stillness, Poirot found his thoughts circling back to the heart of the matter, the deep complexities of human nature that had driven each of these people to their breaking point. He had seen them all in their darkest moments, and yet, in the end, they were human, all too human. And that, Poirot thought, was both their greatest strength and their deepest flaw. Justice, in the end, was not so much about punishment as it was about understanding. Understanding the forces that shaped these individuals, the pain and love that had twisted their lives into something unrecognizable. And it was in that understanding, that recognition of the delicate balance between right and wrong, that Poirot had found his peace. As he sat there, the world outside his window slowly awakening to a new day, Poirot knew that his work here was done. But he also knew that the real journey had just begun, for them and for himself. The mysteries of the human heart, with all its contradictions, would continue to unfold, and he, Hercule Poirot, would be there to observe, to understand, and, when necessary, to seek justice. With that thought, Poirot rose, his mind already turning to the next case. There was always another mystery to solve, another heart to understand, and the world, in all its chaos and complexity, would keep spinning on, forever. Lingering mystery. As Poirot's train began to chug slowly away from the desert station, the quiet rhythm of its wheels clicking over the tracks seemed to match the steady beat of his thoughts. The towering mountains of Petra were just visible in the distance, their jagged peaks now softened by the early morning light. He had solved the case, yes, but there was a restlessness in his chest, a nagging feeling that wouldn't let go. It wasn't just the case that haunted him. It was the lingering shadows of Mrs. Boynton's past, the secrets that had been buried so deep they had never seen the light of day. As the train pulled out from the station, Poirot leaned back in his seat, his sharp eyes scanning the passing landscape. He had not expected the conclusion of this investigation to weigh on him as it did. It was a case of liberation, of family torn asunder, of vengeance enacted and justice delivered. And yet there was something about Mrs. Boynton's death that didn't sit quite right, something that didn't add up. He was lost in these thoughts when the train's motion came to a halt with a sudden jolting force. The sound of brakes screeching against metal echoed in the otherwise silent air. Poirot, startled but not alarmed, looked out the window just in time to see a solitary figure approaching the train. A Bedouin man, dressed in the flowing, earth-toned robes of his people, was striding purposefully toward the platform. It was the guide who had accompanied them on their journey through the desert, the man who had led them to Petra. The same man who had remained an enigma, silent and stoic, his eyes ever watchful, his presence always just a little too observant for comfort. Poirot's brow furrowed. He had not seen the man since the investigation had concluded. Yet here he was, standing now just outside the train door, waiting for the detective. The desert wind tousled the man's long, dark hair, and his expression was one of quiet intensity. Poirot, ever polite but always cautious, raised an eyebrow as the man approached. "Monsieur," he greeted, his voice smooth, yet tinged with curiosity. "It is a surprise to see you here." The guide smiled, but there was a coldness in his eyes, a knowing, almost ominous gleam. He glanced over his shoulder, as though ensuring no one else was within earshot, then turned back to Poirot. "It is not the end of the story, you see," the guide said in a low, gravelly voice, his accent thick but clear. "Not the end for you or for her." Poirot's interest piqued immediately, his fingers tightening around the edge of his seat. "What do you mean, monsieur?" His voice remained steady, but inside, his instincts were alert, on edge. There was something in the guide's tone that sent a ripple of unease through him. The guide hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he reached into the folds of his robes and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. No larger than a handkerchief, but its contents seemed to burn with significance. "This," the guide said, pressing the envelope into Poirot's hand, "was found among the belongings of Mrs. Boynton. A personal letter, one that no one else knew about. She had it hidden, you see, for years. It tells a different story of who she was." Poirot studied the envelope carefully, noting the faint seal pressed onto the paper. It wasn't anything he recognized, but the mere fact that it had been concealed for so long added layers of mystery to the case. He turned his gaze back to the guide, his eyes narrowing. "Why have you given this to me, monsieur?" "What is it you are telling me?" The guide looked at him with a slow, knowing smile. "The truth, it seems, is not always what we believe. Mrs. Boynton was not the only one with secrets. Her past, it is tangled with something far deeper, something tied to the land itself." Poirot's grip on the envelope tightened, his pulse quickening ever so slightly. "What do you mean?" The guide's voice lowered even further, barely a whisper now, but it carried the weight of unspoken truths. "There are whispers among my people, whispers of a family long lost to the sands, of a woman who made enemies in places you cannot imagine. Mrs. Boynton was more than just a cruel matriarch, Monsieur Poirot. She was connected to something darker. And now, with her gone, those who seek her secrets will come for what's left." A chill ran down Poirot's spine, though his face remained unreadable. The guide's words felt like a stone being dropped into the quiet, stagnant waters of his mind, sending ripples that threatened to unsettle everything. Mrs. Boynton's death had not been an isolated event. It was part of something much larger, a web of conspiracy that stretched far beyond the confines of the family and the immediate murder. The guide turned to leave, his cloak billowing behind him as he moved toward the station platform. "Be careful, Monsieur Poirot," he called over his shoulder, his voice distant yet loaded with forewarning. "Not all stories are told with truth. Some are buried in the dust, but dust, it has a way of returning." Poirot stood frozen in his seat, the envelope still clutched in his hand, the weight of it suddenly heavy with implications he couldn't yet fathom. His mind, ever sharp, churned through the possibilities. What had Mrs. Boynton been involved in? What had she hidden so carefully? And why had it been so dangerous? And more importantly, who else was involved in the dangerous game that had played out under the veil of a family tragedy? And, with a final glance at the retreating figure of the guide, Poirot's gaze turned to the envelope once more. As the train slowly began to move forward, carrying him away from the land that had borne witness to so much tragedy and intrigue, Poirot knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. There was a mystery still to be uncovered, a deeper conspiracy that remained hidden in the shifting sands. And Poirot, ever the seeker of truth, knew that the echoes of this case would follow him for a long time to come. As the desert stretched out before him, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, Poirot's mind raced. There was no doubt about it. He would return. The story was far from finished.